The Christmas music has started up. In every store, in malls, merchants are trying to get us in the Christmas mood of giving, or at least the Christmas mood of buying. When I was in the Philippines in September, there was Christmas music in the malls. My sister has had her tree up since the beginning of October. But we forget that this is a liturgical season all its own, the beginning of the church year, the season of Advent. And instead of Christmas decorations, well, there is the purple of Advent. And we don't sing Christmas carols, not just yet. Depends on what Lupe wants to do tonight. In fact, the beginning of Advent presents the exact opposite of the sweet and syrupy Christmas sentiments that we get in the mall. Advent begins not with cribs and shepherds and silent night, but with a prophecy that God will make a powerful intervention in human history. And it turns out to be like nothing we've ever experienced. So just to set the context a little bit, it's 587 BC. Jerusalem is surrounded by Babylonians, and it's under siege. King Zedekiah has locked Jeremiah up for making negative prophecies concerning the fall of Jerusalem. So even back then, rulers were very sensitive about fake news. And that's what Zedekiah wanted people to think. But you have to know, Zedekiah was awarded his job by Babylon as a puppet king. And only later did he decide to rebel against Babylon. And that's where we are in the story when we hear today's first reading. Sort of like the Empire Strikes Back, the rebellion is not going well. And so the fall of Jerusalem is imminent, and Jeremiah is warning against this. But he is also convinced that the fall of Jerusalem, and after the people are in exile for 70 years, that God will bring them back. In fact, he is adamantly declaring that no matter how bad it gets, it will get better. No matter how long it takes, even in this case it was to take 70 years, God will bring them back. And that's where he starts today's prophecy. The days are coming, says the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel and Judah. That's the message Jeremiah had for the people. That God is faithful. That even when we turn away from God, God is always faithful. And so it was more than just the return from exile, the immediate needs of the people that Jeremiah was concerned with. Jeremiah was insistent that there was a bigger picture involved. That what he was talking about was more than just the here and now. He was about the fulfillment of a promise that went all the way back to when the people of Israel were chosen. Jeremiah was talking about salvation, about the promise of a Messiah. In those days, he says, in that time, I will raise up for David a just shoot. He shall do what is right and just in the hand. In other words, I, God, will remember my promise, and I promise to save you. And it's the basis of our faith. It's why we are all here. It's why the incarnation happened. It's why Jesus was born. It's why God became human. It's why God suffered. It's why God died. And it's why God was raised from the dead. Because of a promise made, and a promise that was kept, a promise of salvation. The days are coming, says the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel and Judah. Because God is ever faithful, and God always keeps his promises. And that's the promise we recall today as we start the new church year. We start with hope, as we always do, because we look forward to the fulfillment of God's promise. That a shoot indeed came from the tree of David. And that's exactly what God did. Jesus, from the house of David, came into the world as a tiny, vulnerable baby, exactly the way we least expected. And just because God fulfills promises doesn't mean that God fulfills them in the way that any of us ever expected. And this is important because God became one of us. One of us in our misery, in our search for answers, in our uncertainty, in our own weakness. God became one of us in our doubts, in our limitations, in how we question our faith and wonder if God is indeed real, in how we always want God's plans to fit in with our own. In a most unexpected way, God became one of us, and God made our condition his own so that we could really understand each other. Because God broke out of heaven and raced into poverty, embraced it, and took it as an identity. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to hear more and more about this. Next week, John the Baptist will proclaim, "Prepare the way of the Lord." And the week after that, he will insist that one mightier than I is coming. And so we are invited to prepare for the promise to be fulfilled. We are invited to recognize that salvation is at hand. We are invited to get ready for the baby who is going to enter our hearts. Advent speaks about the preparation and the transformation. Preparation for the coming of Jesus Christ. And for us here in the Northern Hemisphere, Advent takes place during the darkest days of the year when there is the least sunlight. And that is exactly why Advent is a season of hope, because it reminds us that the dark time will come to an end and the light of Christ will triumph. And the church really emphasizes this by the choice of readings that we have. The story of the birth of the Christ child is told in all the days leading up to Christmas, and in the Mass of Christmas Vigil, and especially in the Mass of Christmas Midnight. But the Mass during the day, Christmas Day, is not about the story of Jesus' birth. The Gospel of Christmas Day is about the fulfillment of the promise of salvation, because the Gospel of Christmas Day is the prologue of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be. What came to be through him was life. This life was the light of the human race. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. That, brothers and sisters, is the promise of Advent. That salvation is at hand. That we as a church and we as individuals are called to bring light into this darkness. The transformation of the world from hatred to love is the work of the Christian. And the season of Advent reminds us that for those of us who believe in Jesus Christ, this work is never done.